So, you want to invade Europe. Simple enough. First, you gather the largest amphibious force in human history, about 7,000 ships and 156,000 men. The tricky part, naturally, is keeping it a secret. The Allies' solution was Operation Bodyguard, a plan so audacious it bordered on theatrical comedy. They created a Phantom Army, the first U.S. Army group, complete with inflatable tanks that would hilariously deflate if a cow bumped into them. They even hired a general, George S. Patton, a man the Germans were genuinely terrified of, to command this army of balloons. His job was to stomp around Kent, making a lot of noise and pointing menacingly at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point to England. The Germans, brilliant strategists that they were, bought it completely. They kept their best panzer divisions waiting for a phantom invasion, staring at inflatable Shermans while the real deal was assembling elsewhere. It's a masterful piece of deception, proving that sometimes the best weapon of war is a convincing lie and a good air pump. The Germans weren't totally clueless. They knew an invasion was coming. Somewhere. Their answer was the Atlantic Wall, a name that sounds much more impressive than the reality. It was less of a wall and more of a series of very angry, very concrete tantrums stretched over 3,000 miles. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man in charge, took one look at the defenses and basically had a panic attack. He frantically started planting millions of mines, spiky steel contraptions called Czech hedgehogs, and angled wooden poles tipped with explosives called Rommel's asparagus. The goal was to shred landing craft and impale gliders. Gruesome, but creative. Still, the wall had massive gaps. They were short on concrete, short on manpower, and relied on outdated artillery pieces scrounged from all over conquered Europe. So what you had was a terrifyingly lethal beachfront property in some places and a glorified fence with a "keep out" sign in others. The trick was not knowing which one you were about to land on. Before the fighting, there was the crossing, and the crossing was, for most, pure, unadulterated misery. The English Channel on June 6, 1944, was not in a good mood. The decision to go was made by General Eisenhower, based on a single fragile forecast of a brief weather gap by a meteorologist named James Stagg. Talk about pressure. On the choppy water, thousands of men were crammed into flat-bottomed landing craft called Higgins boats. These boats were essentially plywood boxes with a ramp, designed by a Louisiana boat builder, and they were perfect for running aground and getting shot at. They were not, however, designed for comfort in rough seas. Most of the soldiers, who hadn't eaten for hours, spent the entire journey being violently seasick. Imagine being cold, soaking wet, terrified for your life, and surrounded by the sights and smells of 30 other men vomiting. This was the heroic prelude to the Great Crusade, a floating wave of nausea and fear heading straight for fortified machine gun nests. Glorious. While the seaborne troops were redecorating the insides of their boats, the airborne divisions were having their own special kind of fun. The plan was to drop 13,000 American and 7,000 British paratroopers behind enemy lines to sow chaos and secure key bridges. Precision was not a word in the 1944 Airborne Dictionary. Thick clouds and heavy anti-aircraft fire meant pilots were essentially guessing. Men were dropped miles from their targets into flooded marshes deliberately inundated by the Germans, where many drowned under the weight of their own equipment. One poor soul from the 82nd Airborne, John Steele, famously got his parachute snagged on the church steeple in St. Myer-Glees, where he played dead for 2 hours. Then there were the glider troops. Their rides were essentially wooden crates with wings and no engines, aptly nicknamed flying coffins. Their job was to crash land silently near strategic targets. The landing part was optimistic. Many disintegrated on impact with Rommel's asparagus poles or hedgerows, making for a truly terrible way to start your invasion. And then there was Omaha Beach. If anything could go wrong, it did. And if it couldn't go wrong, it found a new, inventive way to go wrong anyway. The pre-invasion naval bombardment, meant to soften up the defenses, completely overshot the cliffs due to cloud cover, barely inconveniencing the German defenders. The innovative amphibious duplex-drive Sherman tanks, designed to swim to shore, were launched too far out in the rough seas. Of the first 32, 27 of them sank straight to the bottom, becoming instant, ineffective artificial reefs. To top it all off, Allied intelligence had somehow missed the fact that the mediocre German 716th Division had recently been reinforced by the far more experienced and battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division. So the American troops of the 1st and 29th Divisions landed on the wrong parts of the beach with no tank support to face an enemy twice as strong as they'd been told to expect. It wasn't a plan anymore. It was just thousands of individuals trying not to die on a 5-mile stretch of sand. The opening hours were less of an assault and more of a catastrophic, bloody traffic jam. While Omaha was a lesson in Murphy's Law, the other 4 beaches were having a slightly better, though still objectively terrible day. On Utah Beach, things went shockingly well, mostly by accident. Strong currents pushed the landing craft 2,000 yards south of their intended target onto a much less defended section. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the only general to land in the first wave, famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here," which is a very confident way of saying, we are completely lost. Over on Juno Beach, the Canadians met ferocious resistance, but in a fit of national determination, pushed farther inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. Meanwhile, the British on Gold and Sword beaches brought their toys. An arsenal of bizarre-looking modified tanks called Hobart's Funnies crawled ashore. There were tanks with giant rotating flails to clear mines, tanks that laid bridges over gaps, and even flame-throwing tanks. It was a display of wonderfully eccentric British engineering, proving that if a problem can't be solved with brute force, perhaps it can be solved with a very weird tank. From the German perspective, June 6th was a masterclass in institutional paralysis. Field Marshal Rommel, the one man who might have mounted an effective defense, was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. He had to rush back after being told the news, which has to be the worst "your boss called" moment in history. The German command structure was a tangled mess of overlapping authority and pure confusion. Meteorologists had assured them the weather was too poor for an invasion, so many commanders were away from their posts. And then there's the famous story of the Panzer divisions. The most powerful armored units couldn't be released to counterattack without a direct order from the supreme leader himself. But he was asleep, having taken a sleeping pill, and his aides were too terrified to wake him. So as the largest invasion in history was unfolding, the critical tank division sat idle, waiting for their napping Führer to give the okay. The fate of Europe was literally held up because of a "Do Not Disturb" sign on a bedroom door in Bavaria. You cannot make this stuff up. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had a foothold. It was a bloody, tenuous, and ridiculously expensive foothold, but it was theirs. They had landed 156,000 men and were on their way to landing millions more. But D-Day wasn't the end of the battle. It was the start of the real nightmare, the Battle of Normandy. The German assumption was that the invasion force could be thrown back into the sea. The Allied assumption was that they'd break out into open country quickly. Both were wrong. Instead, they found themselves fighting in the bocage, a hellish landscape of ancient thick hedgerows that turned every single field into a natural fortress. This wasn't a war of sweeping maneuvers. It was a brutal inch-by-inch grind through bushes and ditches. To keep the army supplied, the Allies performed one last logistical miracle. They built 2 entire artificial harbors, the mulberries, and towed them across the channel. It was an absurdly ambitious solution to an impossible problem, which pretty much sums up the entire operation. A plan full of flaws, executed with brutal inefficiency and unbelievable courage that somehow, against all odds, actually worked. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!